Hello and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a range of different mediums, books, movies, games, all of it. However, we can only talk about them in terms of the writing. Acting, art, animation, mechanics, anything like that is off limits. I'm Daniel Radford, author, POV character, and also your host, and today I am back again with John Kernan for the start of a new cycle.
There's always more, and we're gonna keep coming back around.
Yep, we'll never run out. That'll never be a problem, I really hope.
Worst case scenario, we redo a couple of topics again, considering most, if not all, of these topics have at least 100 different interesting things we could do.
Honestly, that's fair. Speaking of interesting things we could do, though, we're trying something a little bit more out there with this particular cycle's theme, and we're going to take a look at narration and perspective.
Two
Clarify
of my
that.
favorite things.
That's good.
I'm something of a perspective myself.
Okay.
I should have said narrator since that's something I do, but
That would have
you know,
actually
here we
been
are.
true.
Here we are. I also I have a perspective. There we go. Nailed it.
Flawless intro on all counts so far. So to clarify, we're talking about the voice that is actually telling your readers your story. Is it an omniscient onlooker? Is it one of your heroes? Does the narrator alternate? There's a lot of different ways for a writer to handle this, and depending on the story, the impact here can be minimal, or it can play a really significant part in the experience.
Yeah, including things like, is the narrator a character? Or is the narrator just a voice with no character? Or is the narrator not a character in the story, but the narrator is very clearly given a personality and is a character, just one detached from the physical events happening?
I can't believe you've already managed to bring this up. This is one of the things I was planning to save, for toward the end.
Oh no.
Amazing. We are knocking this out of the park. That is definitely a thing you can do, and it is very much a thing that is going to become very relevant when we talk about some of our more specific episodes later on in this cycle, when we talk about the Stanley Parable and when I have some guests to talk about Secrets of Slumber, which I'm excited about. But we can probably get into that a bit in this episode too, why the hell not? Where we make the rules here.
Hey, I mean, I was thinking of it too because I actually just watched a very good movie a little while ago that has a really strong example of a narrator.
Oh?
Yeah. Might suggest that as my contribution to the cycle. Haven't
Okay.
made up my mind yet 100%, but it's a strong contender.
That's pretty hype. Well, we can keep the viewers in suspense. This is the content. Us figuring out what we're doing next week. This is the content they tune in for.
That's right.
So, if we're going to touch on that a bit later, I think maybe we could start off technically backwards, but I think it's actually a better starting point. And maybe start with some talk about third-person narrators.
Ah, yes. Third person narrators. The lovely category which we have to frequently decide between third person limited, third person omniscient.
I mean, it actually gets more complicated than that, because even within
Oh,
limited, you can have shifting focuses.
you can have
There's the traditional
that.
background noise.
Oh.
Not you.
Oh.
Things just blowing
Yeah,
in the
like
background on account of weather inside the room and all.
we've got those coming in. Then we've also, in the case of third person limited, got the question of which kind of limited? Limited in what the narrator knows, or limited in what the narrator is saying? Because there are narrators who are only telling us about things that have happened relevant in the story from a certain perspective that they can see, or there are narrators who still clearly are detached and know everything that is going on, but they're only telling us certain things, a certain perspective.
It's funny, right? I feel like third person by default tends to create a more clear cut and objectively true narrative, right? Because the events as described, generally speaking, are not colored by the biases or biases, whichever one it is, of characters within, which means the audience can draw their own conclusions more freely and take everything more as they see it. But conversely, it's also the way the narration option that it makes it easiest to conceal the thoughts and feelings of characters because the words on the page aren't their thoughts.
Yeah. And maybe the narrator doesn't even know their thoughts, or just doesn't think they're relevant. It's kind of up for you to decide based on how you're spoken to in the reading.
Well, yeah, I mean, that comes down in part to, is the narrator actually a character or not as well? It's a surprisingly, when you think of it, like, big deal.
It
Uh,
is, yeah.
I think we can probably agree that if you have an omniscient, non-character third-person narrator, that you are definitely, or at least almost definitely, getting the objective, true story.
Yeah.
There are advantages and disadvantages to that. Like, when it comes to choosing perspective and things like a narrator, I personally don't think there's any one version that's better or worse. I think a lot of people would argue first person's better because of X, third person's better because of X, limited or omniscient is better because X, Y, Z, whatever. I genuinely think that they are just good at different things and you pick them to suit your purposes.
Absolutely. It's all about what kind of story you want to tell. And, of course, most importantly, since it's literally what the narrator is for, how you want to tell it.
Exactly. I think in a story where you have a more objective point of view, the advantage is basically that you know who's good, you know who's evil, and you could just sort of settle in for the ride, for example. Or you don't have to question everything necessarily, but by the same token, you are free to ask questions more readily and to decide for yourself who you agree or disagree with. It's a bit of a
Yeah,
double-edged sword.
all you can do is make up your own mind, because you know what happens. Uh, but on the same token, you're not always being told people's motivations and feelings, and the most important thing, both for better or for worse, with that one is you are not being told what to think, just what happened.
Yeah, I think that is the best way to put it, I think. You're not being told what to think. There's no perspective like coloring it. You are just being told the events of the story.
Here's
Um,
what happened.
yeah. Here's what happened. What do you think? And that has it can make things clearer in like your traditional good versus evil story. It makes it easier to see who you're like, if your protagonist are on the right side of things or not, and by the same token, because it gives you a clearer view of all sides, you are more free to question that.
Yeah. Narration is also a thing that changes drastically depending on the medium.
True.
For instance, movies and video games can exist without having narrators at all. Books cannot.
Yeah, it's that's honestly something I hadn't really thought of, but you're right. Medium definitely also plays a factor here because you don't need a narrator at all for certain types of medium because you're just
Yeah,
seeing events play out as they happen. You don't. It's visually in front of you, so you don't need someone to tell you the story, which is interesting because generally speaking, I would like assuming that the writers and or directors or whatever aren't intentionally messing with your perceptions. You would assume that to be the most objective version of storytelling at all, like period, with
yeah,
allowances for things like showing things that aren't real. The creators actively distorting your view.
yeah, of course. It's not always it's also, like everything, always a little more complicated than that too, because those other stories also have different perspectives they can show you based on the medium, and in those other mediums, the narrator having a narrator at all and everything about the narrator is forced to be a much more conscious decision on the part of whoever's making the thing, because in those mediums the narrator is not just how you tell your story, it's a part of how you tell your story, whereas it is much more literally exactly how you tell your story in the written word, especially novels. And I think that's interesting because it even comes down to decisions as minute as how often does your narrator chime in, and also in a way is more limited because you almost always, if you have a narrator in those other mediums, are going to have a narrator as a character, because if the story is going to be told to you in an objective way, for the most part, there are a couple notable exceptions, which I assume were very specifically aimed for by the creators in those cases. If you're going to be told the story objectively, it's going to be done by the camera, not by the narrator.
It allows for a contrast that you can't have in written form in a lot of ways, because you could have objectively what you are seeing as fact playing out in front of you, and then also be treated to the very biased personal thoughts of a narrator. I think, interestingly enough, I don't know the comics, but I think a really good example of that is actually Deadpool.
Yeah.
Because the contrast between his general, like, very light-hearted, disaffected nature and the typically violence we see on camera accompanied with it goes further to demonstrate how not quite right in the head that character is. But it also gives us a window into his more human moments sometimes, which is a
True.
very good use of narration. And if you're gonna break the fourth wall, you may as well make it both funny and enlightening.
Yeah, it is one of the most interesting things about the two movies. And, you know, there's also the character Deadpool, I think it might have been unintentional, but probably not because he intentionally cribs from a lot of other characters' stories in one way or another. The character that originally came from, I believe, Mr. Spider-Man himself, even though, unfortunately, we don't get as much of that in the movies. We get a little bit of it, but in the comics, you're much more consistently treated to Peter Parker's inner thoughts. He has a frequent and detailed enough inner monologue that he's very often talking to you even when nothing has happened, and becomes his own narrator.
Yeah,
It's a fun thing.
it's unfortunate. I feel like narration in movies and things like that actually gets a bad rep because it's mostly used for the sake of exposition. And people always talk about exposition in a negative light, but to be frank, in a movie you have so much less time that I think it's a pretty valid use of your narrator to just
Yeah,
give the
and
basics of the world and get it out the way so you can go into the story informed and with the context you need. Because in a book you have the space to give all that context as it becomes relevant, but you don't have that.
yeah, there's absolutely nothing wrong with using a narrator for exposition. I mean, who else is supposed to give you exposition when it's there to happen? I think the real problem with narration in a lot of those movies, in a lot of movies and stuff, I should say. Although I think some still get a bad rap when they're using their narrators just fine. Is a lot of them fall back on exposition being the reason the narrator is there instead of something the narrator does in the course of doing their job. That's the thing you have to watch out for that very reason I brought up earlier, in that it's almost impossible to have a narrator in a movie or a video game without the narrator being a character of their own because it's going to be somebody actually talking to you. And in that case, you have to do something to make them an interesting part of how you're telling your story, and you need to have a little more nuance to them than just telling you what happened or telling you what things mean beneath the surface. You don't
Yeah,
quite have to do show don't tell, but you gotta put a little razzmatazz in the telling.
yeah. I mean, it makes me think of Galadriel's narration at the beginning of the first Lord of the Rings movie, where she's talking
We
about all
stand
the
Galadriel.
races and the history there, right?
Yeah.
Because she gives you the information that you need and the context and everything, but also the fact that she has a bias towards the elves as an elf is completely transparent.
Look at all these things going on, and despite it all, the elves remain so stalwart and smart and hot. Look at them, nothing could corrupt them. They continue on in their beauty, even as they're all dying, and most of the ones alive are leaving on boats because shit sucks. And oh boy, look at those
And
elves.
here's why it sucks. Look at the humans and their highly corruptible, power-hungry nature, the fuckers.
All those humans. Everything was great until they come along. We only had a lot of non-human war and violence and corruption when they were around, but then they came in with all their human stink.
uh,
Everything was great before they came along, before the Silmarillion goes along and is like, actually, things were already not great before humans came along, by the way.
they may have marked a turning point in the degree of shittiness, but things were already on that trajectory. They maybe just
Things have
sped it
been
up a
getting
little bit.
things have been getting worse probably longer than there have been humans.
For sure. Uh, as, as far as wrapping up real quick on the third person stuff, just a couple of things I want to get out of the way as well, because we're about to get a lot into character narrators, I suspect. Some advantages I think in a third person narrator, right? It is much easier to bounce rapidly between your focus characters. Like, generally speaking, you need like breaks or sub chapters if you're going to bounce between perspectives, first person, and have it feel natural. But it's a lot easier to do like paragraph to paragraph, bouncing around with the camera almost when you're a third person narrator.
Yeah, it absolutely is, because changing character to character with third person narration is changing what you're looking at.
Yeah.
Whereas if you want to change when you have a first person narrator, then you are completely changing the perspective altogether.
Yeah, you are completely changing how the story is being told because the person who is telling it is different all of a sudden. And, conversely, though, like, you could argue that that does also mean that the narration is less personal. It's harder for the reader to form a connection with the story in a lot of ways because it's not having a conversation almost, it's reading a book. It's obviously not a perfect parallel because you're always reading the book or watching the movie or whatever. But it does feel more intimate and personal when a character is directly telling you their story.
That's one of the reasons so many narrators have personality injected to them, honestly, is in place of that connection you can get from it being a character that's narrating you. Because, as I love to say, is the narrator just a voice? Is the narrator a character, or is the narrator a character?
Yeah, exactly. Is it a character or a character in italics? We could get into third person, like the nuances of third person more probably, like more about the benefits of omniscient versus limited versus everything. We could talk about how it gets like messier to distinguish between things like dreams and flashbacks in third person compared to first person because of that omniscient view. You're not in the head, so it makes it like a little blurry. But I think that could also be an advantage too, depending on the story you're telling.
It absolutely is because you can still say it or try to find ways to more directly communicate it. It just in that case, instead of being something that's going to happen regardless, it's up to the author to decide how they want to communicate that because they've both not given themselves quite as strong a foundation to spring from, but also a lot more options to work with for how exactly they want to tell that.
Yeah, I mean, I did it in a Domino. I did a dream sequence in third person. Granted, it was limited perspective, third person, because I was bouncing between focusing on characters, but it was pretty easy to tell it was a dream sequence because things in the environment didn't quite match up. You were hearing disembodied voices in a very grounded story. Things like that are pretty easy ways to signal when that sort of thing is going on.
Yeah, that's always a fun one. It's definitely better than my least favorite version of having a dream in any story, which is things are happening, maybe a couple here or there are weird, but you get nothing clear until somebody starts repeating the same thing and having a character getting scared and going like, "What? What?" and then you have to wake up. Wake up. Oh god, I hate characters starting to hear somebody say wake up right before they wake up.
Yeah, it's a good signal, but it's just overdone at this point,
It's it's boring,
and it
it's
feels
tired,
forgetsy.
it's very strained as a real world parallel because I can't think of a time that I have ever heard somebody telling me to wake up before I wake up from a dream.
Yeah,
I've had one or two times where reality has bled into a dream a little bit right before I wake up, but never like that. And other than that, I hate it because I you see it really frequently, and most of the examples I can think of, at least off the top of my head right now, where that's happened are also ones where you don't you don't have that many strong hints that it's a dream beforehand, which in and of itself is fine, but that makes that a very like I don't know, it just makes it an uninteresting way to wake up for me because I'm like, if you're not making it super clear it's a dream, why spoil the surprise in a way in that kind of way
yeah.
instead of letting the person just wake up? And if you are intentionally and also doing a good job setting up hints and making it clear for someone who's paying attention before that it is a dream, then why not also put effort into finding a better way to wake up?
Talking about the dream sequence in Domino actually did make me realize that something I like to address as another thing you could do with third person because I did it a lot about whether I wanted to do that story in first or third person at first. Because, the whole point of it is to show the effects of these horrible things have on ordinary people, right? Which, on paper, you would think that first person would actually be a more logical choice for that. But I went with third because I wanted to make I wanted to highlight that the reader wasn't a part of it. I wanted to make them feel more like a powerless observer.
Which in a way also helps you connect to the kids
Hmm.
and the powerlessness they're dealing with in their own situation.
Yeah, there. I bring it up because we would we've been talking a little bit about the uses of third person, and it's funny because as a reader you can't do anything even if it's first person. Like the end of the story is a foregone conclusion, and you're just along for the ride. Usually, if it's a game, you might have some agency or whatever. But by you emphasize that you are not a part of that and you can't do anything by emphasizing the wall and removing the quotation marks conversation between narrator and reader. It's just another way you can make good use of third person, I think. Sometimes that lack of personal connection can be played as an advantage.
Absolutely, because it's ultimately the difference between you're here, it's happening right in front of you, and you're watching it happen from a nice, safe distance.
Exactly. But talking about pros and cons of things and like that, we've talked a lot about via our discussion of third person, more or less. We've talked a lot about how one of the biggest strengths of first person narration is that it does feel so much more intimate and personal. And we have talked a lot about, as a tangent to that, narrators who are characters in some format. And I do think, for a discussion point at least, first person narration makes things interesting when you're breaking things down and analyzing. Because, unlike with the more objective reality you see in third person, with first person, everything is colored by the thoughts and perceptions of the narrator. Everything in the
Yeah,
world and everything of their own actions is colored by the bias of the narrator and even their agendas. By default, a first person narrator is an unreliable narrator.
yeah, because you can't have a first person narrator that is not also a character.
Yeah, it's completely impossible because you're viewing the story from in their head. And that is a very, very different reading experience than the more objective reality posed by third persons in general.
Yeah, and also
Because,
drastically changes perspective, both based on who your character is and where we are, because I would say that has an even bigger difference between which medium you're getting it in than third person does.
yeah, I think the effect of a first person narrator is arguably stronger in written format than it is in TV or movie narration, because there isn't the contrast of the objective reality you see play out underneath the
I absolutely
narration.
agree. In those other mediums, you have the extra flexibility of the fact that even when you have a first person narrator, it is not your only perspective because there's literally the camera, if nothing else, which gives you the interesting wiggle room of things like showing how unreliable the narrator is from literally showing you one thing and telling you another in the narrator's limited and biased perspective.
Yeah,
But it puts also less importance on the narrator because you can't get the whole story from the narrator's perspective, whoever that may be.
yeah. I mean, it's like we said with like the Deadpool example. Like, it's a very useful tool for showing contrast between the reality of the world and the way it's perceived by the narrator, and that gives you a sense of the character and who they are and how they see the world. That you don't just get necessarily from their dialogue. But I think the biggest strength of first person narration is in the unreliability of it. That you're hearing the story from a person who is being affected by it and who has their own opinions of all the people in it. So you can't trust that you are getting an objectively truthful opinion of the people in the story. Like, as an example, this person may like be walking past a car dealership and be going, "Yeah, the guy who owns that is a liar. He's a scammer, a terrible person," because their car broke down last week that they bought from there. Where the reality
Yeah,
is, that guy probably gave them well, not probably, he's a used car salesman, but quite probably, quite possibly, it's within the realms of the plausible. Gave them a pretty good deal and told them the truth and is just trying to make a living.
yeah, and also you don't know what they did with that car after they bought it.
Yeah.
For all you know, they could have been doing a terrible job taking care of it from the moment they got it off the lot. Because they're not going to tell you if they did.
No, why would they?
You're getting an opinion,
And
not a fact.
even if they 100% believe they did, it doesn't mean they did.
Exactly. At the end of the day, you're getting thoughts and feelings from another person, not fact,
Exactly. It's
which is great.
you're getting you're not necessarily getting lied to, although it's worth noting that a first-person narrator can lie to you.
Yes. That's something you can only get with a first-person narrator. I mean,
It's not,
technically,
but generally
technically a
speaking,
third-person narrator can lie to you, but when that happens, it is
it feels like
then
bullshit.
well, and also because then it's the author lying to you, the story itself lying to you, not a perspective or a thing. You are just
Yeah,
generally being lied to.
yeah. It definitely feels different to have the author lie to you and the character lie to you. I mean, it's always the author lying to you, but it's not the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
When a character lies to you, it's because of the character's agenda. At least that's how it feels. When when you get lied to by the author, just outright abject, you question everything that has come prior and everything that comes after, and not in a good way. It's why the "it's all a dream" trope fucking sucks, because well, nothing's a hard rule in writing. Almost always fucking sucks, because by the end of it, you just feel cheated.
Yeah, 'cause the whole thing was just a lie.
It feels like an exercise in futility, and 9 times out of 10, that's what you get when you have when you have a third person narrator that lies to you. It feels like the author, who you know is just telling you a story anyway, has told you the wrong story.
Yeah, and it can be done well, but it's a lot more difficult to do it well than first person lying because you have to make sure that that lie has a suitable payoff so that instead of going, "Oh, you mean I've had the wrong idea the whole time?" The character, much like at the end of a good mystery, is going, "Oh, I hadn't pieced that together yet."
I mean, that's why I would argue that third person is actually the better option for telling a mystery, because A, it's objective, which means there's unless there's author fuckery, no fuckery going on. But also because it's not in the head of a character, if the character is smart enough to start figuring things out, you don't have to be told what they figured out, which means you can have the big reveal.
Yeah,
That's harder
because
to pull off in first person.
with a mystery, the perspective you're getting is such a massive part of the mystery to the point where, as far as first or third person goes, I mean, in a mystery, first or third person is literally the difference between the audience figuring out the mystery and the character figuring out the mystery. Which, either way, if you're telling a story about a mystery, there's probably going to be characters trying to solve the mystery, but you have wiggle room for them to figure out the mystery and still give the audience extra time, maybe a couple more bits of evidence where before the mystery is revealed. Whereas in first person, you can't. As soon as the narrator has
Yeah,
figured out the answer, you've been told the answer.
otherwise it feels very contrived,
Yeah,
because suddenly the thoughts that you were getting aren't really that character's thoughts. It feels like there's been a like weird paradigm shift. But yeah, I was just thinking it's actually really like it makes no logical sense that it's so, for want of a better word, upsetting to have a third person narrator lie to you, because the story is fiction to begin with. It's not true. But it still feels like you've been lied to.
yeah, because
And
the whole
that's the
point of a
important
story is
thing.
to get you invested, right?
Yeah.
And that's what makes it feel like you've been lied to because that's the main
It
thing.
feels like you've had your time wasted.
Yeah, other than literal
You're
practical
being
consequences,
like,
that's the main thing that makes being lied to feel bad in real life, too. You're like, "Oh, I got invested in nothing? I got invested in a lie?"
at best, like, that's it. At worst, it feels like you've been taken advantage and mocked
Yeah.
implicitly. What were we getting on
Yeah.
about before we started getting on about lies? We were saying something about how
Per
first person narrators, even when they're not necessarily abjectly lying to you, that
yeah, they're
doesn't mean
giving
you're
you thoughts,
yeah
feelings, opinions,
yeah
not
you're not
facts.
necessarily getting the truth.
You're only getting a truth, never the
Yeah,
truth.
that's what it was. That's exactly it. It was you were getting a truth, not the truth. That is exactly what I wanted to get at. Thank you for reminding me. Which I mean, again, like that allows for some very interesting storytelling because you can go through the experience through this person's thoughts of their perspectives and views actively changing, and you can backtrack and go back and see it if you really want the process of their biases changing. You can have a character who, at the start of the story, is intentionally portraying everything in a way that makes them look good, and by the end of it is admitting to their faults.
That's a good point. Yeah, it's in first person you can get a much higher potential for the author. uh, I mean, in first person, the author can actually experience things. 'Cause that's the other big thing, right? In third person, even when the author is a character, the author doesn't have time to grow and change because at best, their personality is the flavor for how they tell you the story. But but the things aren't actively happening to them because the closest they can get to that is telling you the story in past tense, stuff that already happened, which means the development already happened. They're already whatever changed person they are in first person. You're there. It's happening.
Yeah, it's that's like tense has a big impact on first person. I feel like arguably a bigger impact compared to third, even
I would say it definitely does.
because there is there's a big difference between these are my thoughts right now in the moment. This is happening versus this is what my thoughts then were, and I am not necessarily telling you that story as the person I was, because they obviously would have grown between the time the story has happened and the time they're telling it to you. For better or for worse, they could be romanticizing the story, or you could be getting a far more objective version of it than you would have in the first person present tense, having it told to you at the moment.
That's right. It's a great opportunity for a writer, which I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say unfortunately, it's not a bad thing when people don't do it necessarily, but you do see a lot of stories where when it's in first person, the narrator talks in past tense sometimes, except they're not doing any of those things we just mentioned with it. They're actually telling it exactly the same as if it was present tense,
I
except the
mean,
character is just saying, "I did this," or I had done this," or "This happened," not "I'm doing this."
to be fair, the thing with past tense is that there's not like a mandatory buffer period, right? You could describe
No,
something
definitely not.
in past tense that happened a minute ago.
Yeah.
It's a lot less restrictive than present, where you have to describe things as they happen. There is
Oh yeah,
there's a
absolutely.
very big difference between he screwed me over. He slighted me. I'm furious. I have to get him back. Versus I felt angry and slighted, and
Oh yeah.
that
It's really fun to disseminate too.
yeah, and that I felt could have that could can easily be I felt this a moment ago, or it could be I felt this 10 years ago when this actually happened. There is a vagueness to past tense that isn't there in present, and that definitely has a big impact on first person narration compared to third, because third you're getting the much more objective view regardless,
Yeah, exactly.
which is again not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something that you don't really think about generally as a reader, or see, even as an author sometimes. But I would recommend that if you're writing first person, perhaps you should think about it as the author,
Yeah.
because it should those things should arguably color the story you're telling in some way. On top of all that, though, that's all assuming a singular narrator. The interesting thing with first person narrators is that you can have more than one. And all of them are equally as unreliable as each other, in theory. I mean, obviously, there's going to be a give and take. Some will be maybe abject liars, or some will be more honest, or whatever. But from a general perspective, all of them will be telling a different version of the story that is colored by their own biases, perceptions, and the like. And you, generally speaking, these are characters that'll interact. So this doesn't just mean how they perceive things outside of each other, it also includes how they see the other narrators. And that's interesting because it can give you it gives you a grounding point. You can see what these characters look like to people outside of their own heads, which can bring a little objectivity in, except not really, because it's still colored by the bias of the narrator. But it also provides more of that contrast, like we were talking about before, yeah? Where you might have this one character be like, yeah, everything is fine, things got a little bit rough, and then someone else will be thinking back about the same events and be like, yeah, we nearly died and it was that guy's fault.
These things, they happen.
Did you just a really good example, that's all I think. Did you ever read the Animorphs books growing up?
No, I don't think I have.
Wow. So the way that those books are handled, ignoring a bit of hit and missness because there's so many and there was some ghost writers involved and stuff like that, so the continuity could be a little iffy sometimes, but generally consistent. The way it worked is that there's like 6 heroes basically, and the books cycle through them as the narrator. So you've got like one book is from Jake's perspective, and then you've got the next one might be from Cassie's, and so on and so forth. I don't think that's the actual order. I think it was like might have been Rachel next, but whatever. So you have all these young people. They're like 15, I think, at the start of the story. Basically thrust into this surprise secret alien invasion, dealing with like genuinely horrific shit. Like, dealing with stuff like, do we commit war crimes here to save our planet? That sort of thing. But they all have slightly different perspectives of these events and different limitations and moral beliefs, and also different perspectives of each other that grow and change throughout the story. So you get some really interesting contrast because of the way it bounces between personal perspectives. Like, you have a character who is a lot more prone to violence than the others, or she starts off just being more confident and assertive in and of herself, and just gradually becomes grittier and grittier, more addicted to the war, to the violence, more okay with the murder and things like that. And it's like you see from her perspective, she's not she's aware of this to an extent and is like not exactly okay with it, but is mostly of the idea of, this is a war, I'm just doing what needs to be done. I think it's been a long time since I've read these books. And then you'll see her, like, the next book down the line from someone else's perspective, who's like, holy shit, she might become a problem.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Warrior Cats books actually do this thing. Not with the first series. First couple books are all from the perspective of the same character. It is his story, but then once we get to the second generation, the book has a main group of 6, or the books have a main group of 6, and even though the main group of 6 is like together for a significant amount of each of the books, if not the whole book, they switch which person in the group the perspective is following each book, and gives you an entirely different style of narration, and also lets you see each character from multiple different perspectives, because you get to see each character's like at different times feelings and thoughts on the other characters and see what they look like from the outside when you can't hear their thoughts and feelings anymore.
Exactly. Like that's exactly what these books did. Where this character Rachel was like everyone starts off viewing her as as she's so strong and capable and reliable. We can depend on her because she will come through in a fight. To she is volatile and dangerous and arguably unreliable because she has been changed in a way that she has become addicted to the thrill and the danger and the violence, and I don't think she knows how to be a normal person anymore. Or conversely, there's another character who's very pacifist by comparison. She does not like the violence to begin with, and they start off feeling mostly pity, I would say, right, for this character. And then over time, some of the frustrations start to seep in a little bit, where it's like when other people are talking about her, they're talking about her in terms of like I understand where she's coming from, but the reality of it is we are in a violent situation and we can't be pacifists. With third person, we almost entirely talk about the narrator and how they interact with the reader. But when you're in a first person perspective, you can factor in how the narrator is interacting with other characters a lot more as well, and how that colors the narrative.
Yeah, and it also has a lot of potential for stuff to do later down the line if, for whatever reason, your story is going to go on long enough or have enough extra parts. It's like, to go back to the Warrior Cats books, there's a point way later in the story where we get to see a character who was a point of view character and narrator in one of the earlier books go down a dark path, do a bad thing, and then become the focal point of a murder mystery when they are killed. And you can look all that stuff, be like, oh my god, how this character has changed over the years. And also, now he's gone, and after him being a main character and following his perspective for an entire book, not only is he not quite the same character anymore, but now he's gone. Just like that, somebody we had that intimate connection of perspective with is gone. And that's something you can only get out of that close knit first person perspective,
Yeah,
is like
you
that direct
almost
connection to a character where if something serious happens to them later, you're like, I've been in their head.
you almost share in the character's grief with first person, whilst in third person your feelings are entirely your own. Which is definitely interesting. The other thing when you have multiple perspectives is that you can see how different characters feel about traumatic events like that, or and how different characters are affected by it, and you can contrast and get a sense of different things from that. Like one character might be relieved that the guy is gone and not causing problem anymore, but you might have another one who's genuinely heartbroken, and you can like infer to the way that the group is going to change and fracture from this fallout, and then watch it play out. Something else interesting you can do when you have a first person, multiple first person narrators. I can't think of a specific example of this. I know it's been done plenty before, but I'm just drawing blanks on this. Is that you can show two or more different perspectives of the exact same event. I don't
Yeah.
I don't necessarily mean in the way I was saying before, where I was talking in a very general sense of the events of the setting. I mean a specific thing that happens. You can watch it unfold from two different sets of eyes and see how
Yeah,
this one
especially if it's
event
pivotal
looks so
in the
different
story.
to those two different characters.
That's always a lot of fun.
Like something explodes, and this one guy is maybe looking at this going, "Yeah, this was a success. We did it," and this other one is going, "This is so much messier than it was supposed to be. This was a disaster." And you
Yeah,
have to decide
somebody
which
who's
one
just
you
more
agree
like,
with.
yeah, it's funny too because it's almost like a single sentence, but broken up in two. You have one character saying "we won" and another one saying "at what cost."
Exactly. And the thing is, what is because they're both first person, they're both still biased. So their own personal strengths, flaws, biases, and all that are still coloring the narrative. So it's still not an objective version of truth you are getting, even when you see it from multiple different angles. You can piece things together if you really want to create a better, more objective view of it, and that could be fun. But you have to choose to do that.
And that's really the dynamic and interesting part of first person narration at the end of the day is it forces everything to be a choice.
Yeah, that and it does make it more personal.
Yes.
You get to know the characters a lot more because everything is their thoughts, as opposed to you only see or hear things that the narrator chooses to show you.
Yeah,
Which,
that's why I thought it was so interesting when we were talking about Space Boy. And I
yeah,
brought up like you don't see first person narration blended with the visual medium as often as you can, but even when you do, you see it much more commonly in it's still pretty rare, but you at least see it sometimes in movies and games and stuff. In comics, it's pretty rare except for like in certain superhero comics, like we mentioned earlier, with characters like Deadpool or Spider-Man, because that's a character trait of theirs is that they have a very consistent inner monologue. They either talk or think to themselves all the time.
yeah. And the thing about Space Boy as well is it's done in such a specific way. Not only is it just naturally more intimate than getting the third person, Amy or Oliver felt this or this event happened from a third person narrative. When they break into these first person narratives, or first person moments, when suddenly the characters are talking to you, the reader, because it's not usually like that, certainly not to that extent, that almost heightens that sense of that sense of intimacy. But also because it's a visual element, Stephen McCready, the author and artist, also often uses these moments to become very poetic and metaphorical, both visually and in the way that the characters describe things.
Which is both an interesting way to tell the story and also another way of showing us an aspect of the character.
Yeah,
Because that's not just the thing of the story. That's
how that character thinks about it.
and I'm choosing this word intentionally, giving us giving us some more of Amy's flavor in the process of telling us the story.
Well done. I mean,
Because that's a part of it being first person is not only is it giving us that extra context but it's specifically and very intentionally coloring not just how the story is told to us but everything that's happening in her perspective and not the limited perspective you get from some people of this is what I think happened, this is what I feel at this moment, but like everything about it blended together and it is her experience.
with Amy specifically, because she has the synesthesia and she often experiences the feelings of others as flavors in her mind, which are illustrated wonderfully the way she perceives different flavors. Like
I love it.
when she describes something as being like citrusy and sweet, and and all of a sudden there's all these visual bright oranges and things, you feel it. It's
Yeah,
so
that's the
good.
nice thing about it, right? You take something that's treated like it's a tick, an oddity, in how somebody perceives things, but you do it in such good detail that all it becomes is a unique character aspect, because as soon as it's described to you, suddenly it's not weird. You can feel it right away. It's
It
so
it
so
brings you
natural
into
to
her
interpret.
headspace, and her and like her world, her experience of the world in a very personal way.
It's a really nice touch.
It's a really, really nice touch that you couldn't do in third person. Not the same way.
No,
As it like, I've obviously, if anyone has listened to enough of this, you've probably come to the conclusion that I alternate a fair bit between third and first person. Because I
there's a lot
like
of
both of them. I
advantages to
think they serve different purposes and are good at different things, and they're usable for different things. I think I've probably shared more third person through the podcast and the site, but I think I maybe and I do maybe generally lean more towards that objectivity, but it's a very slight lean, you know. But I love first person as well. Like, some of my favorite stories are first person stories, but the reason I bring this up is because you can have both.
Yeah. Uh, you
Spaceboy was a
know,
really good example of that. That David McCready tells most of the story from a fairly limited but third person perspective, just shifting where the camera's looking. But then will sometimes draw you in suddenly to a first person narration moment to heighten that intimacy and that sense of the character that is at the focus at that moment. And it's lovely. Someone else who does something similar is JC McCrae slash Wild Bow, the guy who does Worm, Ward, Pact, etc. Take a shot. Uh, he's got like a signature, right, where most of his story is from a first person perspective from the protagonist, but then for interlude chapters, will tell things from a third person perspective, and that heightens the sense that you were start seeing things a little more objectively of the world from outside the experience of the protagonist, which is really cool.
just for a little while. It's a nice touch.
Yeah, it's not just a different perspective in the same way that jumping between first person perspectives is. It's more. It's like it's showing you just a hint of this is all of the rest of this is how the protagonist sees the world. This is more an objective how it is. That's a little less prevalent in Pact, I think, because a lot of the interludes are done as excerpts from books, which are written in first person. But there's like a whole other chapter that's in that third person kind of style, so still sticks
Ooh,
with it a bit.
chapters from books, huh? Bram Stoker style, perhaps?
Maybe I'm not super familiar with Bram Stoker or uh, like
To be fair,
Dracula and all that, but
I've only read one of his books, and it's Dracula. But
I
the
think that whole book is basically almost done like diary excerpts. It's a little bit like that.
yeah, oh yeah, that's it. Dracula is told to us exclusively through letters, diaries, books, whether those are sent to or read by other people or not. Every little bit of the story is told
Yeah,
to us through something somebody in a character in the world, whoever the current narrator is writing.
yeah, it's a little bit like that. The interludes impact.
Nice. I like that.
Yeah, it's a good way to sort of show not figments, fragments of how different people see the world. And something else, of course, that we touched on quite accidentally very early on is that you can take a third person narrator and give them a personality, and therefore all the biases and unreliability that comes with having one of those.
Yeah, that's where the character in italics comes from. In is the narrator a character or a character?
Which is an interesting way of telling a story, right? Because you are playing with some of the pros and cons of both.
Yeah, the narrator, despite being detached from the world and not necessarily existing in it, is still a person with a personality and maybe even biases who is telling you, the reader slash listener slash watcher, the story.
That's exactly, and that leaves you open to some very interesting things. Like, we're gonna do an episode on the Stanley Parable soon, and there you have a narrator who you get to watch get progressively more annoyed with you, who are taking the place of the character, which is a bit weird. And in the fourth episode of this cycle, we're going to be doing well, uh, myself and some guests are anyway, going to be doing Secrets of Slumber, which is a web serial where, oh god, does the narrator have personality, despite not being one of the characters. They are very interesting.
Ooh, fun. I can't wait to look at it.
Yeah, you should. I'll send you a link actually to the story so you can give it a read sometime. It's still fairly early into it, but it's shaping up to be very weird and wonderful, and I'm very excited to get further into it and to have that discussion on it with the creators. That being said,
And
though, I don't want to get too deep into it now. Otherwise, there would be no need for that episode.
no, and then before we finish up with this bit too, another game came out recently that does the same kind of narration thing as the Stanley Parable, but with a completely different um premise, setting, and like way you're going through the game, and that's called it's a game called Slay the Princess. Really interesting. I definitely recommend looking into it.
Oh, okay, I've never heard of it.
Yeah, I mean, I won't say too much about it, but the premise is you're a heroic type, but for whatever reason, you have not been sent on a quest to save the princess.
You've been
You have
sent to
been sent
murder
on a
her.
quest to kill her. It is very important that she dies according to your goal and the narrator, who will not leave you alone.
And who you can't necessarily trust is telling you the truth.
No, and they do an interesting thing where you not only have the narrator talking to you, but you occasionally get an inner monologue from your character. And because these people have obviously already seen the Stanley Parable and also other things with this style of narration, your character inner monologue actually has two voices that can talk to the narrator. There's the regular one, which just says the hero, and there's another one, which is what they expect players who just want to be chaotic and make a mess of things to act like, literally called the contrarian.
Oh, that's very cool. I like that a lot.
And the contrarian is just the voice that represents the person who always wants to make the messiest choice or just do whatever they can to not follow the story or to make the narrator miserable.
The person who wants to make the world burn with no consequences.
Yeah, no, literally. It's just they just give that perspective a voice, and it's the contrarian.
That's very funny. But yeah, we should leave that there so we don't start getting too into things that we're going to discuss in subsequent episodes.
Yeah, we already get lost in the weeds. No need to get lost in the woods too.
So yeah, thank you for bearing with us on this one, audience. Hopefully, you won't notice any of the technical difficulties we've had, but just in case you did, sorry in advance. But also, this is, as a cycle, a bit more of an experimental sort of theme. It's simultaneously a lot more specific than previous ones, but also kind of abstract and weird and more technical.
Very true.
But
But that's why we're doing it.
that's why we're doing it, and to test the waters for more stuff like this, see how it goes, see how people react, and also it was just kind of fun and interesting to talk about.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And of course, obviously, we're invested in all the things we talk about here, but talking about narration is a pretty personal investment considering it's something we both do in like all the different contexts of narration
That
too
is
between us.
that is true. We are both different sides of that coin, in that as a storyteller, as a writer, as an author, primarily. I mean, obviously you've done writing too, but like, you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean,
It's what
I
I
write, but
do.
I'm not like I'm not a published author who's doing it all the time and making a career out of it.
Yeah.
I'm just a hobbyist. Although I am glad because it's very useful. Well, one of my favorite things about storytelling is every different angle you come at it from informs every other angle. Being an actor, a reader, a narrator can make you a better writer, better author, better like storyteller,
You can
like
make
a
use
good
of it all.
story. It all weaves together.
And that's the thing, like, you have dabbled in all of those things and are a narrator. Just in case you'd missed that from, the previous season and a bit at this point of John literally narrating my stories at you.
I like narrating; it's fun.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought of it, but it is kind of a more personal topic in a lot of ways because it's in different ways for each of us for sure, but it is what we do. It's
Exactly.
literally a big part of what we do as part of this podcast. So there you
That
go.
too.
But yeah, and until then, as always, if you are listening to this elsewhere on like Spotify or Google Podcast or something, you can find these episodes on my website, radfordwrites.com, as well, where I also post things like the transcripts for stories I write for the podcast, poetry, other stories, and a bunch of like blog and article posts and stuff as well. At the time of writing this, I just recently did one on writing action scenes, which was kind of fun to write. Uh, definitely check that out. Plugging my own
I sure
stuff
will.
on my own show, because why not? And I believe you are now, at last, actively streaming again.
I have. I did my first stream just a couple days ago. Monster Prom, one of my favorite games to show
Speaking of
people.
narrators,
Yes, I do in fact during that stream also read out the narrator and many of the characters. Monster Prom has a great narrator. VOD's not up yet. It'll be up soon for anybody who might be interested in watching or for anybody who wants to follow. I can finally find actually plug. It's a Sephir. Sephear. There's not a lot there right now. Ignore the VODs from old stuff. That's just me messing around. Those aren't the real attempts. I'll probably get rid of those at some point. But should be more coming soon.
that is hype. Also, you can find more of my bullshitting on the website formerly known as Twitter, where I'm Daniel Wright 7, or maybe on Blue Sky if I'm still doing that. Over there, by the time this episode comes out, as I've been saying for the past like 8 episodes now, where it's Radford Writes. We'll see you guys next time.